Thanks for joining us on a casual stats podcast tonight. We have Matt here with us, who's going to talk over some statistics with us tonight. Matt, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I have a varied background. So my undergrad degree is actually athletic training. My master's is exercise physiology. My PhD is actually neuroscience. And while I was doing my PhD, I did a fellowship in statistics and statistical computation. I've been, I graduated about a decade ago from my doctorate. So in that kind of time, I've worked for the United States Army in an R&D role. I've worked for the Defense Health Agency in kind of a data science statistics role where I work primarily with the orthopedic and physical therapy communities, developing analytical approaches both for operations and for research purposes. And now I'm at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute, where I'm kind of blending both my physical medicine background, neuroscience, and statistics. I've kind of become known for more of my statistical work than my kind of subject matter expert work, which is funny to me because I never sought out to. I never had designs on being a statistician, but that's kind of where I've become. I always kind of considered I was willing to do the other work or the type of work that other people didn't want to do. And so in my dissertation, my doctoral work, I ended up looking at the effect of sex hormones on the nervous system because my perception was no one wanted to look at gender differences or sex differences and things that might underlie those differences and do it well. And so I said, okay, fine. If no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. And that's kind of how the analytical statistics work ended up coming about too, was just that it was like, all right, I'm really unhappy with what I'm seeing out here. And if no one else is going to do it well, I'm going to do it well. And hopefully I can, pass that along and make the field better. And so that's kind of how I've gotten to where I am and talking to you guys today.
Yeah. I think I've come across you on social media and as a clinician, and this is why we wanted you on, I guess Megan's in her PhD, so she's a little different. She has some statistical knowledge, definitely more than me.
Say some, not as much as Matt, for sure.
Yeah, probably right. Yeah. But as a practitioner, you get what you get in PT school, which is something, but it's pretty basic. And then you get PTs writing journals about p-values being maybe not important, which whoops. And so on social media, I just sit back and get to listen to statisticians talk amongst themselves and try to pick stuff up and end up Googling stuff. And so I just think it's something that as the PT practitioner community can get a little better about understanding statistics, especially when reading research articles, which I think motivated clinicians are doing to try to improve. But then how do we know, you get to the statistics section of a paper and you're just like, I don't know if this is the right test or anything like that. And so I think it's helpful to get opinions and thoughts from the likes of you all.
Yeah. And my opinion on this is probably going to be different than what you'll hear from other card-carrying PhD holders and probably from other clinicians too. So I've published a lot of papers with orthopedic surgeons who are brilliant individuals. Like it takes a lot to become a higher tier orthopedic surgeon, both as a clinician and then as a clinician researcher, right? And so we've published a number of papers in places like American Journal of Sports Medicine and other sorts of, and Journal of Orthopedic and Sport Physical Therapy. And it's funny because I have this continual discussion. It's the same thing over and over. Sometimes it's with the same people and sometimes it's with different. And I always tell them, look, if you can write the intro and the discussion and, help me to make sure that we're doing the analysis in a way that's consistent with answering the right research question, and I hope you can revisit that, then I'm happy to write the methods and the results, because in my head, I write the methods and the results so that someone later can go back, if this is their expertise area, they can go back and reproduce it line for line, right? I write that for other researchers with the idea that, sure, if you get a clinician who's really motivated and wants to try and understand and pick it apart, but I honestly don't expect someone without a master's degree in statistics or again, a really motivated and skilled statistician to understand what I'm writing in the method section. And I've read papers where you actually, like in American Journal of Sports Medicine, where they get in trouble because they kind of dumb it down. And then I go and read and I go, well, the results don't make any sense. They're not consistent with what they wrote in their analysis section and what they were trying to do. And there's actually where I wrote a letter to the editor with a colleague. And I said, well, it doesn't make any sense. You're saying you got all this stuff, but you didn't. And they responded, and their analysis was perfectly fine. Like, it was actually a very well thought out, but I think somewhere along the line, someone told them, hey, that's too technical for this journal. You can't write that, but it has to be consistent throughout the paper. So there's definitely a balance to be struck. Like I said, I kind of would say, like, well, I don't expect a clinician to understand the highly technical analytical work. I don't even expect most PhD individuals who are subject matter experts in neurophysiology or thermoregulation who have had 2 to 3 stats courses to understand it either. Especially if it's a really technical, if it's a more basic one, certainly. But I think that on some level we have to recognize our own expertise and then be able to ask the right questions. And I think that's hopefully what we can relay here is, are we asking the right questions, and can we pick apart things where, like, we say, is that right? That doesn't sound right. And I think I feel like there was like a guy, Dusty Grooms, who's out of University of Ohio, does some really fantastic, interesting fMRI work. And again, my PhD is in neuroscience, and my PhD is not in brain fMRI work, especially the connectivity measures that he looks at. And I'm familiar with them. I can kind of breeze through them and go, okay, that sounds relatively reasonable. But unless it's what I do on a day-to-day basis, like, I'm not going to expect a clinician to understand the brain connectivity metrics either. And again, I can read them and go, okay, I think that sounds reasonably good, but I would not pick out some nuance that's specifically wrong because it's just not my particular expertise area. So I think, we want to become certainly more competent, but you don't want to expect someone to be perfect in every single aspect, because we all have our expertise areas,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so I know you went from like AT to, all of these other stats, neuroscience. How did you feel like you got so well versed in statistics? Was it your fellowship? Did you have specific mentors? I know you said now you sort of serve as a consult mentor for other people writing methods and stat sections. Like, how did you grow in your expertise, or do you find that it's just sort of something that you latched onto and you're really kind of naturally gifted at?
Certainly not. So what I'll say is that, in undergrad, I had the main stats course I had there was a class out of a psychology department called Statistics and Psychology, which was fine for undergrad course. And we had 2 or 3 courses in my master's degree. And I would say that I didn't really understand any of it. I honestly had trouble staying awake, which is just like, I was snoozing, which is impressive in a class of 8 people to have trouble staying awake. So it didn't really become engaging to me, the kind of actual analyses, until I was actually in my PhD, and I was taking. So I showed up there, and they said, "Oh, here's the 3 stats courses that people take in this department." And I go, okay, well, I've had research methods. I had that in my master's degree. Why did I take that again? And I think the other one was something like, multivariate analyses or something, or correlation regression. And I said, well, I've had that course too in a kinesiology, mindset. I don't need to take that again. And they said, well, what do you want to take? And I go, well, let me look at the book. And so the first class I ended up taking was actually called Applied Regression. And it was, funny enough, a night course given out of, so I went to University of Texas for my PhD, and it was given out of their business school. So it was taught by someone who was one of the lead econometrics person for the state of Texas, because we were in Austin, where the capital is. And so it was someone who was teaching a night course. And so he was teaching regression analyses, nothing complex, but things from a totally different perspective, from an econometrics perspective. And, sometimes when things are taught a different way, you have to kind of bend your mind around and go, okay, well, how does this fit for my expertise, for the things that I'm interested in? And so when you start like thinking like, okay, that makes sense. Well, I wonder if everything else is wrong that I've, or maybe I didn't actually learn the things that I thought I did. And so, I took that course and I go, huh. And so in the course of my PhD, I ended up taking probably, 50% subject expert courses and then 50% stats courses, either in the educational psychology department or in the statistics department at the university. And then ended up doing the fellowship. But the fellowship, for the most part, was really a course in here's how you act as a statistical consultant. So it actually wasn't as important to learn a method or a series of methods. It was more like, here's how you work with people who are smart, but not necessarily statistics experts, which actually has been super helpful for my future life, since that's a lot of what I've done. I mean, I do plenty of analyses myself, but I spend just as much time working with others, making their work better, and that sort of thing. And from there, it's kind of just like learning on your own, picking up random books. Yeah. I honestly found that the one course that I had that really set me on the right path, other than that applied regressions class, was a class on multi-level modeling. Because that mindset just formed a basis for so many offshoots of things I've done since then. But again, it's, if you're talking about all the courses you take in grad school, 50% of them were in statistics departments.
A lot of mine have been in statistics as well. Yeah. Just by choice, because they're like, you get extra classes, and I'm like, okay, stats. But we run into a little bit of issue. Like you're more of an applied, you've got that clinical background. We have a team of statisticians that we work with for some of our projects, but they have no clinical background. And so, like you said, sort of marrying, the correct statistical approach that answers the question, but also is presented in a way that the reader can understand. Right. And we'd run into issues where they did statistical analyses, and reviewers, which a lot of times reviewers for these clinical papers are PTs. The peer reviews are typically not people with robust statistics knowledge or the ability to kind of sift through that and say, yes, this is correct, or they'll say this is too confusing and they don't understand it. Did you ever feel like you ran into issues with that with your kind of peer review with journals, or how do you feel like you can kind of marry the two of having it being accessible to the clinical reader, but also, let's say, statistically appropriate and robust? Because that's a challenge that we deal with often.
Yeah, well, and I think, honestly, a lot of that, it comes down to a lot of statisticians, even if they are good at statistics, and not all statisticians are, but even if they are good at statistics, they're not necessarily good statistical consultants. In that, again, because I have the physical medicine background, the sports medicine background, I know how to ask some of the right questions when I work with clinicians who are saying, hey, here's my question. One orthopedic who I love to work with, Judd Robbins, who's published maybe more papers than I have actually, but just in his economics, he uses the word correlate for everything. And it would drive me nuts. And I would just say, Judd, just tell me what your question is. Don't tell me what you want to do. Tell me what you want to answer. And he could then give me that. And I go, okay, that's not a correlation. There's nothing about this that's a correlation, but everything, like if you asked him what he wanted, he would say, well, I want to correlate the X and Y. And I'd be like, just what do you want to answer? And so like some of that, he just, there's a defined skill to say like, look, like to get the clinician to like give you what they actually want to answer. And then you can say, okay, all right, let's look at the data. Yeah. All right. We can't answer that exact question, but we can answer these four, kind of related questions. And here's where I think kind of my like actual expertise in sports medicine helps, because I can kind of translate their question in the data and then give them a couple of options that say, hey, here's the 3 or 4 that, are one of these interesting. Oh yeah, actually 2 of those are interesting. And then there's a separate question of then translating the kind of the resulting analysis to papers. When it comes to translating and working with reviewers, it's always hit or miss. My doctoral advisor, who was not necessarily analytically oriented, used to say that, she didn't like heavy statistics because she felt like it meant that people were hiding things. And so I think that there are reviewers and scientists who feel that way. A lot of the work that I do these days is not lab oriented. It's kind of real world evidence oriented. And there's just fundamentally no way without a lot of really rigorous statistical analysis, you're going to have valid results. And so I don't tend to get reviewers who have the expectation of clean analyses anymore. And so that's, for better or worse. And so reviewers, what can I say? It's
what can you do?
It is what sometimes you get good
you
ones.
Love to hate them. It's always reviewer number two.
And sometimes you're one of them.
Yes, I've been that person before, I'm sure.
I mean, I found that, I've been reviewing papers for years. I don't review as much as I used to, as I've become kind of less and less academic and more working with people who are doing the academic side of things. My early times reviewing, I would often, and it's reviewers are learning too, right? And hopefully they're recognizing that they're learning. But in hindsight, I look back at some suggestions I made and I was like, that's a good suggestion if they were me. But I was asking them to execute analyses that they were not equipped to do. And so then they would do it wrong or poorly. And I'd go back and say, well, yeah, this is not any better. And is it really on them?
You're like, just call me, I'll help you.
Right. Is it on them or is that on me though? I think we need to, there's some level of learning that reviewers need to do about themselves when they're doing the review process. So, but that's a science thing. It's probably better since hopefully this podcast is more talking to clinicians. I think it's more, I maybe want to go back to something that earlier in life for me. Straight out of undergrad, I went straight to my master's degree. Right. So undergrad is again, so I came out of athletic training when you could have a bachelor's degree and be a certified athletic trainer. So now it's master's and PT is a DPT, obviously. But I, got my first year of my master's degree. So still didn't have too much of a science background, a little bit more, but not necessarily research methods at that point. And I don't know why, but I was going back and I was going through this is my old, I brought a prop. I know we're on a podcast, so it's not a visual medium, but this will be
on YouTube. They'll see it.
Right. Well, there you go. So I have my fourth edition. Yeah. So the fourth edition, Rehabilitation Techniques for Sports Medicine and Athletic Training by William E. Bill Prentice, who actually, so I was at North Carolina for my master's. And Bill Prentice was at North Carolina. I used to see him in the gym. So very nice guy. I'm not trying to badmouth him, but for some reason I was going through and looking at this during my master's degree, and this, and he has a passage here. And so you got to remember, this was, I don't know when the fourth edition is dated, but I graduated undergrad in 2007. And so that was still at the time point when, whether it's patellofemoral pain syndrome or ACL reconstruction, the focus was on the VMO. Oh, we got to get the VMO, the patellar mistracking. Oh, train the VMO. Don't worry about the other stuff. Yeah, you got to have the other stuff, but really focus on the VMO. We're going to really target it. And that was kind of the heyday of that kind of rehabilitative thought process. And that was just what you were taught. And so you kind of went with it, right? But I still kind of went back. And so this was the rehab book. And this was probably one of the more popular rehab books in AT curriculums at the time. And it'll go back and it has a line here that I had highlighted. It says, the VMO is innervated by a separate branch of the femoral nerve. Therefore, it can be activated as a single motor unit, which is patently false. So I don't mean to say that because, I'm so smart. But it's cited. So it has a citation there. Right. And so this is what I mean. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, statistical analyst to know this kind of stuff. All right, look at the citation. The citation goes back to a 1985 book, Muscles Alive, which is actually kind of one of the quintessential EMG books that was ever written. It's a really famous book. And again, this is my field, so I can, but it cites the entire book. The book is 110 pages long. So I literally looked through the entire book. The entire book does not say the word vastus medialis oblique anywhere in the book. So I have no idea where the citation rationale came from. It's not there. And so I think that like just that desire and the to critically evaluate the things that we're being told as fact is just really important for clinicians and scientists alike to kind of go through. And I again, it doesn't take like parsing the nuance of a statistical analysis to read something and go, that doesn't sound quite right, or I wonder if that's actually true. Go look at the citation, and say, okay, they cite an entire book for one thing. That seems kind of weird. Maybe I should like figure out if that book actually says that. And I mean, like I said, it only took me about a half an hour to leaf through the book and go, it's not there. But I mean, we see this. I'm writing with a couple of people, different either papers or letters to the editor about some of the sex differences work that's out there, and I'm also writing a paper about jet lag in human performance, athletic performance, and it's the same thing where you have people that do these like circle citations. Well, this paper cites expert consensus. This paper cites a review. This which cites another review, which cites another expert consensus. Nowhere did anyone do any original research to actually say that, hey, there actually is, an effect of jet lag on human performance, or an effect of a gender difference that's actually real and meaningful. And so you kind of get these things where, again, it doesn't take someone with a lot of brain power. It just takes someone who actually says, that doesn't sound right, and is willing to spend half an hour, 45 minutes going down a rabbit hole to say like, yeah, it's just a bunch of people talking and without any actual evidence.
Yeah, I've been down similar rabbit holes with some stuff lately. Like we're doing a lot of stuff with neuromuscular electrical stimulation for the quad. And, there's several reviews, commentaries, clinical guidelines, and suggestions. And if you actually kind of take the citations and track them back, it's sort of like, where did this come from? And it kind of leads, like you said, to like a dead end where like that initial citation is really not, it's either an opinion or it's some like super loose, vague reference that has just been carried forward. And then it's said in another paper and that paper gets cited. And then it just sort of snowballs. And then all of a sudden this suggestion becomes, a dogma that nobody questions until you kind of unveil the onion and realize that, it's kind of built on a house of straw, perhaps. So
right. And I just feel like I see it over and over, especially in this sport and physical medicine space. The fields of cardiology have been really good historically. Oncology has been really good. But for whatever reason, the sport physical medicine space has been a lot of expert opinions that then become dogma. And then we spend years, trying to push back against it. And eventually, truth wins out because things that don't work fail eventually, but it just takes a long time, unfortunately, for us to kind of get there. And the other thing I think that we kind of, when we're looking at papers to evaluate is, you really only have maybe 3 or 4 questions that can be answered, right? You're either doing description, you're either describing your data that you have at hand, you're doing a prediction problem, which I'd argue is not usually nearly as helpful as we think it's going to be, or you're doing an inferential problem, inference. And maybe a subset of that might be causal inference, depending on who you talk to. You're always going after causal inference, whether or not you're actually doing it or not is another thing. And so you'll often see, papers that are fundamentally doing either description or prediction. They're often saying like, oh, it's all the risk factors papers. Well, the risk factors say this. Okay, well, risk factors papers are really either description or their prediction or their description plus prediction, but none of that is actually causation, right? And so it's like, well, does it matter? The thing that's always really bothered me, the modifiable risk factors. Okay, it doesn't matter because there's nothing saying that if you change the risk factor that it causes a change in the real world. All that's saying is that if you have a prediction model and we modify one of those in the model, that alters the outcome of the model. But that's not saying that in the real world, which is why you do a randomized control trial, because you can say that, right? Yeah. And so we got to be careful with our wording too, because you'll see this with social determinants of health. All all those determinants, those are just predictors. They're not actually, like, determinant sounds like a causal thing, but if you actually look at things, they haven't done any causation analyses. They're just predictions. And so but a determinant, it sounds very determinative, right? We just need to be a lot more careful with our wording, because especially the way that it gets interpreted at the policymaking level or at the clinician level is way more definitive than the actual evidence states.
Humans do like certainty.
False or not, right?
Yeah, we'll latch onto it, and that's my identity.
We've all been there.
Yeah, of course. So would you argue, when reading a research paper, ask like what question is trying to, before you even start diving into stuff, like what is trying to be asked? Read a little bit of the, I don't know, would you say like read the abstract?
I mean, it's always worth reading the abstract before you read the paper. You don't want to waste your time, right? I mean, I always think that, you should come pretty early into the paper. You should get a feel for, what are they trying to do?
Yeah.
Are they, again, which of those things are they going after? And if you can't tell, well, that's not a good sign either. Yeah. Because a lot of times it's, again, kind of like a weird mix of the two. Because prediction usually, again, like I could say a Pearson correlation, right? That's clearly descriptive. It just tells you, hey, we have this sample, and we drew a straight line between two data points, or between two types of data, and that's our Pearson correlation. It's purely descriptive, right? Something like a regression equation could potentially do all three, right? It really is dependent on the study design. If you've got, a randomized controlled trial and you do a regression analysis, then it could be causal inference, and you get causation. But you could do the same thing where the data is just collected more haphazardly or in a single arm, at which point it then kind of becomes a descriptive study, right? So you have to kind of think about, just what's going on, what are they trying to get at, and then again, like, does the design match it? And then I really don't think you need lots of statistical background most of the time to understand, all right, are they generally doing the right thing? Obviously, picking out nuance is different, but to actually say, like, all right, which of the 3 or 4 things are they going after? Description, prediction, or inference? All right, we've cleared that hurdle. All right, look at how they're collecting the data, the study design. All right, does that seem to match with what they're saying they want to do? Okay, it does match. And then, the analysis, again, if they're saying they're doing prediction and they're running a Pearson correlation, that would be kind of weird. That would tell you, like, they probably don't know what they're doing. And then, but again, I don't think it requires lots of nitty gritty to see if those 3 things kind of match up. And you go, okay, everything seems to line up in my head. Let's look at the results now. And see if it fits. And again, we try and go through that when I teach grad students too, is like, hey, you really only have 3 options. You don't need to complicate it, but you got to answer that question first of which of those 3 it is.
Sure. So for our listeners, could we kind of talk through a little bit of the description, inference, prediction? Just don't want to assume listeners know that kind of stuff. So could you talk us through those?
Yeah. So like I said, description it's fundamentally saying, hey, we have either this population, if you got the entire population, right? Or we have this sample of the population, and, we want to describe it, right? What's the mean? What's the standard deviation? Let's plot a histogram of something. Oh, it looks normal. It has the mean of, 50. It has a deviation of 10, standard deviation of 10 from that 50. So it's just describing it. And that has a lot of value as long as you're not necessarily trying to extrapolate it, right? Well, we'll get to prediction first. So that's, as long as you're just taking it for what it's worth, descriptive studies are really helpful to try and get a feel for what's the problem, what's the population, what's the problem within the population. It just becomes problematic when you try and draw out, like, okay, what's the clinical utility of that, right? Because fundamentally you don't necessarily know. It just kind of tells you, here's for this ailment that I see in the clinic, here's what they might present as, right? Which is helpful for diagnosis. It just doesn't necessarily help you for treatment, most likely. prediction can be related because, again, we said earlier that, risk factors, a lot of times that's just a multivariate model. So it's a regression with a bunch of variables in it. If that is, if they're not doing any sort of kind of holdout validation, and they're not predicting out of sample, it's probably, despite it, that kind of gets in a middle area, right? It's probably still mostly describing the population that they have. But you can make an argument that because they're drawing a regression line and they're doing things that it's kind of prediction too. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in between these, obviously. But prediction is really fundamentally about saying, hey, we built a model, we built an algorithm, go use it in the future to predict things. The problem with that is that, does it work? Is it well validated? That does require some level of analytical expertise, but also kind of subject matter expertise to figure out like, hey, is this going to work out, outside of that one lab that they did? And there's been some work done, especially in the medical sphere, saying that, all of these prediction models, whether they're machine learning or not machine learning that are built, the vast majority are never actually used clinically. And so it's like, well, why are we publishing this stuff, guys? So I think that I wish journals would be a bit more circumspect when they decide whether or not prediction papers are worth publishing, because they fundamentally have to be able to be deployed to regular clinics to actually be used and to be useful. And I've published a few prediction papers, but they were very nuanced is not the right. They were very niche. And that they were trying to solve a very singular specific problem. And they were not necessarily, that a clinician would see the front end of that. They would see, it would be applied on the back end and then would be deployed in a clinical system. So, I always also say that things like injury prediction models, which thankfully the sports field seems to have moved away from mostly, they're mostly garbage because they don't tell you anything. All right, if you get a, right, that we think the algorithm thinks 90% that this person, is going to get injured in the next 6 months. Okay, what do? You don't know, because again, the algorithm doesn't tell you causally what's going to cause the injury. So it's really just like, hey, I talk to the person, I guess, evaluate them. But again, it doesn't tell you what, why, or how. And so prediction, especially kind of black box predictions, are not typically all that useful. So the third is inference, and specifically causal inference, which is the field that I've mostly worked in recently, kind of in a real world evidence context. Ultimately, this is just trying to say, compared to doing one thing, how is doing another thing different? Or, X causes Y. So it's always, and the way to think about this is that it's always about a counterfactual, right? If I have a patient in here, I have two options. I can put an ice bag on them, or I can not put an ice bag on them. What's the differential outcome we're going to get for that branch? Okay. After we do that, we're going to take them through X, Y, and Z rehab protocol. We're choosing to implement that protocol as opposed to some other protocol or bed rest or whatever. And so when looking and thinking about those, it's often important, because you see this a lot, especially with modalities research or recovery research, where their counterfactuals is useless. It's nonsense. So like, and I won't name the company, but there's one recovery company out there that says like, oh, use our tool and it increases blood flow 300%. Okay. Their increase in blood flow is compared to sitting there and doing nothing. So, okay, there's a lot of things I can do to increase my blood flow to a limb 300%, like walking or like doing calf raises, like things that don't require you purchasing their device. And so the counterfactual is wrong, right? So, you always, with inference, you always have to think about, there are the things that we're inferring differences of are one or both meaningful, or are they actual choices that we kind of have in the real world? And then are those outcomes, are they meaningfully different, or are they not meaningfully different? One that might be worth talking about because it's used a lot by clinicians is when I was working with the DoD, was we spent a lot of time with the minimally clinically important differences or minimal clinical differences and that sort of thing. And that's kind of interesting because it tends to, that work kind of splits the difference between prediction and it kind of merges some of the three. So like the anchored clinical difference metrics are all technically prediction problems. They're within sample prediction problems. And then the non-anchored ones are actually descriptive problems in that, they essentially say, okay, we've got the ACEs, which is like a shoulder survey, right? And then, all right, we get our sample population of 200 soldiers, shoulder surgery patients, and here's our distribution. All right, we've decided that our 2 standard deviations away from the mean, that's our cutoff for, and that's sometimes the unanchored clinical difference metric is just based on that distributional aspect, whereas the anchored ones are often based on something like a receiver operator curve, where they'll ask a secondary question like the grok, which is just, do you feel like you've gotten better or whatever? I don't know what the exact wording is, but they ask a singular question, and then it's essentially a prediction of how well that measure fits that. But you know what? If it's that easy to ask that one question, then just ask the one question. You don't need to go through the stupid survey, right? So why are you anchoring it to something that's just a one binary question when you've got a theoretically psychometrically valid instrument already? So a lot of the MCID stuff, it might be okay for a rule of thumb, but it doesn't make any analytical sense whatsoever. Yeah.
And I think you've written some papers on MCID as well. And I think, I don't know if it's you or other people talking online, but talking about the application from population to population. So if we measure shoulder surgery or protocol A versus or whatever after surgery in military personnel, then applying that to my clinic with regular people, right?
Yeah, I think that some of that. So first off, remember it's descriptive, right? So it is going to be specific to the sample, and you have to question whether one sample generalizes to another. Right. It's a good question. Again, as a statistician, in my head, I kind of say, well, you know what? The problem is actually that an MCID should have confidence intervals around it, right? Because it's actually a point estimate of a wider unknown truth in theory. So the problem is that we treat that MCID as like this threshold to cross, when in fact it's just a random point within a confidence interval. And so I don't know if we actually accepted that it wasn't some, godlike threshold, and that it was actually just kind of a fuzzy number in amongst other fuzziness. I don't know that the population would be quite as meaningful. I think some of the arguments about it are like, all right, if we just did better analyses to start off with, then we wouldn't have to worry so much or be quite as concerned about some of that stuff. But that could be debated because there's no ultimate truth on either of those is kind of my opinion.
Fair. So the summaries just be better.
I think that I think if you use valid psychometric patient reported outcomes, I don't think MCIDs are necessarily something you need to concern yourself with.
Sure.
If a patient's getting better and its trajectory of change is good, the rate of change seems to be good, like, why are you worried about an arbitrary threshold that someone published?
Sure.
Yeah.
Fair.
I mean, and again, so like that's like the clinician in me kind of coming out and saying like, all right, sometimes the science matters, but sometimes you don't need like a heavy duty analysis. I mean, sometimes you definitely do, because I mean, I live in those heavy duty analyses. But I think, sometimes it's again, is it worth getting in the weeds, or can we just kind of use our brains and think better about, okay, it's, if you see someone who's oscillating, I think you have a couple of questions, right? Is the tool you're using valid and good, right? Or does the measurement error too high on the device? And that's any device, right? or is the underlying thing you're trying to measure, that kind of latent property that you're trying to measure, whether it's strength or depression or whatever, is that actually oscillating? And that's different, right? If you fundamentally think that the underlying property is unstable and not improving, like that's what you need to work on changing. If it's something about the measurement device, it's kind of like, okay, like either get a better measurement device or don't use that one. You know.
As for stat sections and papers, of course, it's going to be difficult for some clinicians to kind of decipher exactly what's going on. And like you said, maybe we don't really need to. As far as like overstating findings, are there certain things that you think, students or clinicians should look for in conclusions or discussions that may indicate that the authors are taking liberties with their findings, or maybe overstating, like giving too definitive of conclusions, or, are there certain things, commonalities that you see emerge with people kind of taking that extra step?
It's really hard. And I say this as someone who's literally in the process of responding to editors or reviewers who are thinking I'm overstating my findings. So, it's you can have really smart people making very good points. And sometimes it's like, there are certainly clear examples where people are, it's probably less about, I'd be more concerned about misrepresenting their findings, right? I mean, that's the classic, like vaccines and autism that sprung from a Lancet paper that like, it just didn't say that, or a textbook that doesn't say that the VMO is a single activated motor unit, just doesn't say it. I think that's probably like the more blatant when you get into the gray areas of, because I think that it's natural. You do an analysis, or you do a study, you do an analysis. My personal opinion is that the discussion is there to discuss your findings. It's to say, hey, we have this finding. It's in this population. Here's what we think it means. And I think authors should be allowed to say that. Here's what we think it means. And here's how we think it should be applied, if that's, right for the journal, right? I think that it's valid for the journal and reviewers to say like, you took a little bit of step on that, how it should be applied. Like, but I think that authors should be given a little bit of liberty to say like, here's our findings, here's how we as the authors are interpreting it. And it's reasonable to give alternative interpretations. But it's, it's certainly looking at if what's on the graphs and what's in the charts and the plots doesn't match what they're saying, that's obviously a red flag. The other red flag, and again, this is someone who's looked at a lot of papers, is anyone who's got like, bar charts or other sorts of things when it should be a continuous variable, because, kind of chunking your data in weird ways is classic p-value hacking, or splicing it, in so many ways when it shouldn't have been spliced in the first place.
The y-axis is like the tiniest increments of units, and then the bars look super asymmetrical.
Well,
and bar charts are supposed to be for categorical, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And again, like as someone who we all learn, right? And so I have papers early in my career where you can find those, and it was chunked like that, and you kind of go, okay, well, we're not going to do that again. So hopefully everyone's kind of learning as they go, and so I don't begrudge people if they make a mistake once and they move on and do better later. But it should give you a red flag to say maybe something's being not purposefully hidden, but it misinterpreted. It just give you a little bit of pause. That a lot of times is the big red flag for me. The other is if you just kind of run into inconsistencies in looking at things, and it doesn't match up in funny ways, and it's hard to kind of articulate that because, and again, it kind of came back to like looking at that, the textbook and going, something like doesn't sit right with me in my gut when I read that, and I kind of get that feeling, but I'm not sure. There's no definitive word. The other thing that that stands out to me is definitive words. Again, authors saying, this may lead us to rethink X. doesn't bother me. This does cause us to rethink X. I think that's definitive. So like, I don't know. I allow a little bit more leeway if it's them opining as opposed to stating. And so but it's important, as a reader of research articles to read that nuance, hopefully, and not take from it something definitive, right?
Totally. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, like figuring out what kind of question they're asking, descriptive, inference, prediction, things like that. Are there any other things that you feel like after that, or is there a flow you feel like people, I guess, should go through? So we see our research article, we figured out, okay, this is what they're trying to ask. It seems reasonable. What other kind of steps do you think is a reasonable thing for clinicians to kind of then go through after that?
Yeah, the lost art in statistical analysis for some reason has been everything we do, right, always has assumptions baked in. When I'm walking, I assume that what I'm walking on is solid ground. Like, you always have assumptions baked into your everyday life and how you approach the world. And statistical tests are no different. They all have underlying assumptions, some of them philosophical and some of them analytical. And it's not that I wouldn't expect, especially a clinician. Now, if you have a PhD and you've taken a couple stats courses, I would hope that you know some of the basic assumptions that underlie something like a t-test or like a multiple regression. Because I think that if you had 3 stats courses, hopefully you know that. But I try and encourage, when I review papers, to just have authors write in, we checked the assumption for heterogeneity, or constant variance, which is the more common sense way of saying heterogeneity, which is to say that the errors are randomly populated throughout the data. So when we build our model, our regression line, we draw it through, it's not like there's more error on one side of the regression line than the other. Because if you try and draw inferences and that error is not normally distributed or evenly distributed, let's say, your average kind of t-test is not robust to that. You're going to get invalid findings. And I deal with this all the time with data scientists that I work with, or other master's level statisticians. And I go, have you checked the assumptions? Like, are the residuals normally distributed? Is constant variance violated? And it's not often checked. And so I think that's, if they state that we check the normality of the data, that's also a red flag, because oftentimes the assumption is not that the data are normally distributed. And in fact, the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head is actually a Pearson correlation, where the assumption is that both data on both sides of the axes are normally distributed, that they're bivariate normal, so both of those. But in all the rest of the cases, it's actually not an assumption that the data themselves are normally distributed. And so if they say that, then you go, okay, I don't know that you have any idea what you're doing. That's the red flag to me, is like, if you tell me your data is normally distributed, I'm like, oh, okay, great, let's see what they did. Which is not to say that their following analysis is always wrong, but it is, to me, a big red flag that they sat in a stats class, slept through half of it, and heard normally distributed, and are going to regurgitate it. So I always like to see that, again, just that in the papers, they're saying, hey, we checked the assumptions of our tests. The assumptions were, A, B, and C. We met those. I don't have any expectation that they're going to show me the plots. At some point, there's a level of trust that you have that the researchers are doing things right, hopefully. That if they say they checked X, that you have to believe them, just like you assume they didn't fabricate their data fully either. So that's the other thing that I would say to look out for. And again, I don't think you have to know exactly what the assumptions are, because sometimes the assumptions can get on the complex side. Not usually. Usually it's just constant variance, equal variances, and normality of residuals are usually the 3 big ones in most cases. And if they say they check those, then as far as I'm concerned, a lot of time that means they've actually done better than 90% of the published research out there.
All right, fair enough. Any good resources that you feel like are out there for non-PhD fellowship trained people?
So, oh man, Daniel Lakins has a couple of, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, but he has, is it Coursera or edX?
Mm-hmm.
He has a couple of
for sure one on Coursera.
Coursera, okay. He's got a couple his Coursera that's excellent. Kristen, she used to be Kristen Cobb, Kristen Sanini, now out of Stanford. She has both a really nice podcast that kind of talks about it in a very approachable way. So
Normal Curves.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's a very good one. Yes.
It's a very well done podcast. Yes. Yeah. And so they do a really good job making really interesting points, just well done. Right. Yeah. And I think she has a good science communication Coursera as well. That I'd recommend.
Yeah, she's a good scientific writing course. Granted, that's not stats, but she's got some really, really great content on there.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Those are good. And I like, what's the other one that, so you kind of just reading kind of other smart people who are not necessarily giving the nitty gritty of analyses. So Andrew Gelman, who's out at Columbia, has a blog with a couple of other people. And he's a very big name. Some of the early books that I read in my PhD work were written by him. But he has a blog that he kind of just opines. And people send him like, hey, take a look at this study. It's kind of weird. And he kind of will give some interesting opinions. And if you read the comment section, he actually gets a lot of really smart people in the comments. And so hearing the discussion gives you levels of nuance that at least you can go back and go, I have no idea what that person's talking about. You can kind of Google and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. So Andrew Gelman's blog, it's not going to come to me. Andrew Gelman's blog out of Columbia is also a good kind of ad hoc resource, just kind of peruse through.
Awesome. We'll try to also maybe can we put a link in the show notes to some of those resources?
Yeah. And if I think of
That'd
any
be
others,
awesome.
I'll get them put in. And yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's where I mostly reside these days. I'm also on Blue Sky. Still trying to figure out what's going on there. I was historically really active on Twitter, but it's become less of a highly used resource for connecting with people. So I'm always up for chats and discussions and that sort of thing. So I respond to almost all messages. I don't know how. I oftentimes can't go into super depth with specific questions with people, but I'm happy to provide specific textbooks if people have things that they're specifically interested in.
Yeah. Great.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. This was super helpful.
Yeah,
people love hearing how they can get better at things that we're not very good at. So
hey,
we're the whole inspiration for this podcast.
Yeah, we're all continually improving in different areas, and that's I always try and say, like, look, you have something you're an expert in that I'm not. It's good to work with the experts and then pick things up along the way, and that's the best we can all do, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Just be a little less wrong.
Yeah, that's always the goal. Every day, be a little less wrong. Oh, awesome. Yep. Well, yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. It was fun.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. You guys have a good one.